Chapter 1. Don't try. Charles Bukowski is the first warning sign that this will not be a polished self-help sermon. He drinks, gambles, works a dead post office job, writes for decades, and is rejected almost everywhere. Then a small publisher takes a chance on him, and Bukowski writes Post Office in 3 weeks. The tempting version is simple. A loser never quits and becomes a success. Manson refuses that version. Bukowski's epitaph says, "Don't try," because his power was not self-improvement theater. It was the brutal honesty of a man who accepted his own ugliness and wrote from it without pretending to be noble. That opening flips the book's title into its real meaning. Not giving a fuck is not apathy. Apathy is another form of fear, a way of pretending nothing matters so nothing can hurt you. The point is selection. Human beings have limited attention, limited pain tolerance, and limited years. The question is what deserves those limits. Modern culture trains people to care about everything. Being happier, richer, prettier, more admired, more certain, more successful, and then to feel bad about feeling bad. Manson calls this the feedback loop from hell. You become anxious about being anxious, ashamed of being ashamed, angry that you are angry. The attempt to eliminate negative experience creates a second negative experience on top of the first. The counterintuitive move is acceptance. When you stop treating discomfort as a personal emergency, the loop loses fuel. This does not make life painless. It makes pain usable. Manson then gives the first subtlety. Caring less about trivial adversity requires caring deeply about something more important. A person who will risk embarrassment for a friend, a value, a craft, or a truth is not indifferent. That person has chosen a better object of concern. This also explains why the book keeps attacking the fantasy of permanent positivity. A life organized around looking good, feeling good, and never being embarrassed is still organized around fear. It is still asking the world to protect the ego from ordinary weather. Manson wants a narrower and harder kind of freedom. The ability to let unimportant pain pass because something more important has been named. The second subtlety is that problems are unavoidable, so maturity means choosing which problems are worth having. The third is that the choice is always happening. You are always spending your limited cares somewhere, whether deliberately or by cultural default. The chapter's thesis is therefore not calm detachment. It is disciplined concern. A good life begins when you stop trying to care about everything and start protecting the few things that can bear the weight of your life. Chapter 2. Happiness is a problem. A protected prince has everything except meaning. His father gives him comfort, luxury, servants, and a sealed palace, but the prince still feels empty. When he finally sees sickness, aging, death, and suffering, he first reacts by going to the opposite extreme. He denies himself pleasure, starves his body, and tries to escape pain through severity. Neither strategy works. The prince becomes the Buddha only after seeing that suffering is not a mistake in the system. It is the system. Pain and loss are inevitable, and wisdom begins by letting go of the fantasy that a good life means their disappearance. Manson then translates that old religious insight into a blunt psychological argument. Happiness is not a solved state you reach after enough upgrades. It comes from solving problems. A problem-free life is not available, and even if it were, it would not produce meaning. Warren Buffett has money problems. The person with no money has money problems too. The difference is the quality of the problems. Growth means trading cheap, repetitive, degrading problems for better ones. This is why the imaginary disappointment panda matters. He says the truths that make life better by first making it less comfortable. Problems never end, pain is informative, and denial is usually more damaging than the thing being denied. The chapter also rejects pleasure as the highest value. Pleasure is pleasant, but it is a poor compass. It can distract from pain without improving the problem that created the pain. Emotions work better as signals than as commanders. A negative emotion says that something deserves attention. A positive emotion says that something appears to be working. Neither one should be worshipped. Manson compares emotional pain to physical pain because pain is often a feedback system. Touching a hot stove teaches the body to move. Rejection, boredom, envy, or guilt can teach the mind that a value, habit, or relationship needs examination. A culture that treats every unpleasant feeling as an error also removes the information those feelings carry. That prepares the chapter's central question, framed as a statement for the listener. The shape of a life is determined by the struggle a person is willing to endure. People want the result, but not always the pain required by the result. They want a good body, a company, a marriage, a creative life, or peace of mind, but each desire carries a preferred struggle. Manson's argument is that happiness is found by choosing and solving problems you respect. The issue is not how to avoid suffering. The issue is which suffering has enough meaning to be worth the work. Chapter 3. You are not special. Jimmy enters as entitlement with a smile. He is a man with endless ventures, endless confidence, and almost no substance behind either one. Jimmy talks about startups, investors, charity events, and big ideas, but he lives off other people, avoids work, and treats confidence as a substitute for competence. He is fun for a while because his fantasy is contagious. Around him, ordinary limits seem suspended. But the chapter uses him to expose a bad metric. Feeling good about yourself is worthless if it is not attached to a reason worth respecting. This becomes Manson's attack on the old self-esteem gospel. Telling people they are exceptional no matter what does not create excellence. Creates fragility. If a person must feel amazing at all times, then failure, criticism, boredom, and ordinary limitation become threats to identity. Entitlement can take two opposite forms. One person believes they are uniquely great and deserve special rewards. Another believes they are uniquely wounded and deserve special exemption. Both forms keep the self at the center. Both say that the normal rules should bend around one's feelings. The cultural machinery of celebrity, social media, and instant comparison only intensifies the temptation because it floods ordinary people with extraordinary images and then tells them that ordinary life is a personal defeat. Manson's answer is not self-hatred. It is the relief of being average. Most people are not extraordinary at most things, and that fact is not an insult. It is the ground where learning begins. Once you stop needing to be special, you can pay attention to what is actually in front of you. Skills, habits, relationships, limits, and choices. This is why adversity and failure matter. They give honest feedback. The self-esteem movement, in Manson's telling, tried to give people confidence without the friction that earns confidence. It confused feeling exceptional with becoming capable. But a person who cannot tolerate negative feedback cannot grow, because all growth begins by admitting a gap between what is desired and what is real. A healthy self-worth is measured by how you relate to the negative parts of yourself, not by how loudly you praise the positive parts. Jimmy feels great while his life collapses, so his confidence is not health. It is avoidance. The chapter's deeper kindness is hidden inside its insult. You are not owed greatness, and you are not exempt from pain. That means you are free to become responsible for something real. Chapter 4. The Value of Suffering. Once suffering is unavoidable, the sharper question is what the suffering serves. One kind of pain can discipline a life, another can waste it. Manson begins with Hiro Onoda, the Japanese officer who kept fighting on Lubang for decades after World War II had ended. Onoda's endurance is astonishing, but it is also tragic because it was organized around a false value. He had courage, discipline, and sacrifice, yet the standard directing those virtues was wrong. Suffering by itself is not noble. It becomes meaningful only when it serves a value worth defending. The fuller Onoda story sharpens the warning. Leaflets, family messages, and official announcements all reach him. But he treats them as enemy tricks because the value organizing his life cannot allow the war to be over. Norio Suzuki finally finds him by wandering the jungle and shouting his name, and Onoda returns to Japan as a strange celebrity from a world that no longer exists. The tragedy is not merely that he suffered. It is that the meaning that made the suffering bearable collapses when he meets the modern Japan he had supposedly been defending. A bad value can make pain feel purposeful for years, then reveal the bill all at once. The music stories make the same point in a quieter register. Dave Mustaine is thrown out of Metallica, builds Megadeth, sells millions of albums, and still measures himself against the band that rejected him. Pete Best is removed from the Beatles, lives an ordinary life, and eventually reaches a kind of peace. Manson's point is not that Best achieved more. It is that the metric changes the experience. If the metric is beating Metallica, almost anything can become failure. If the metric is building a decent life, the same rejection can eventually become bearable. That leads to the self-awareness onion. The first layer is noticing emotion. The second is asking why the emotion is there. The third, and hardest, is asking what value is producing the emotion and what standard is being used to judge success or failure. This is where the book becomes a theory of values. Onoda is not merely a strange war story, and Mustaine is not merely a celebrity anecdote. They show that the same endurance can become either dignity or torment depending on the metric underneath it. The question is not whether a person can suffer enough. The question is whether the suffering points toward something sane. Bad values are based on superstition, social destructiveness, or things outside your control. Good values are reality-based, socially constructive, and immediate enough to practice. Honesty, humility, creativity, responsibility, and care can be lived now. Fame, superiority, being right, and universal approval cannot be controlled in the same way. The chapter then names the 5 counterintuitive values that will organize the rest of the book. Responsibility, uncertainty, failure, rejection, and mortality. They sound harsh because they remove fantasy, but they are useful because each one gives pain a direction. The value of suffering depends on what the suffering is for. Chapter 5. You are always choosing. 2 marathons create the same physical pain and 2 completely different lives. In one, someone forces you at gunpoint to run 26.2 miles. In the other, you train, choose the race, and cross the finish line with people cheering. The physical pain is almost the same. The meaning is completely different. Choice transforms pain because chosen problems feel like agency, while imposed problems feel like victimhood. The chapter does not claim that people choose everything that happens to them. It claims that people are always choosing how to respond to what happens next. William James gives the chapter its strongest personal example. Born into privilege but tormented by illness, failure, and despair, James reaches a point where he decides to treat responsibility itself as an experiment. For 1 year, he will assume that he is responsible for his actions and mental life. Manson presents that decision as a rebirth. James becomes one of the founders of American psychology, not because he chose his suffering, but because he chose a stance toward it. The lesson is later sharpened through the responsibility and fault fallacy. Fault looks backward and asks who caused the wound. Responsibility looks forward and asks who must deal with the wound now. These are different questions. Manson uses the old Uncle Ben line because it is almost right. Power and responsibility are connected, but the order matters. Waiting for power before accepting responsibility keeps a person passive. Accepting responsibility first creates power because it changes the set of available moves. The man who believes women reject him only because he is short has chosen a value that cannot help him. If the value becomes honesty, courage, or compatibility, the same dating life becomes painful but workable. The facts may not change immediately, but the metric changes the problem. Manson uses his own breakup, a reader grieving his son's death, and Malala Yousafzai to test the distinction. Taking responsibility does not mean declaring that betrayal, death, violence, or injustice is your fault. It means refusing to surrender your future reactions to the person or event that hurt you. He also uses deliberately uncomfortable thought experiments. A baby left on your doorstep, a robbery, a tragedy nobody deserved. In each case, fault may be absent or belong somewhere else entirely, but response still arrives in your hands. This is why the chapter can sound severe if heard carelessly. Manson is not erasing injustice. He is separating moral blame from the practical burden of living after harm. Malala did not choose the Taliban's violence, but she chose to keep speaking. The grieving father did not choose his loss, but the shape of his grief still became a burden he had to carry. This is the hard edge of the chapter. Responsibility is often unfair, but it is also the only place power can return. Blame may be accurate and still leave you stuck. Responsibility gives you the next move. Manson reverses the famous comic book line into his own formula. With great responsibility comes great power. The more you own your response, the more room you have to choose better values. Chapter 6. You're wrong about everything, but so am I. Wrongness is not an exception in the human record. It is the ordinary condition of changing your mind. People once believed California was an island. Bloodletting cured illness, phlogiston explained fire, and the sun moved around the earth. Manson then turns the joke inward. His own childhood mistakes, adolescent poses, and adult revisions show that identity is built out of beliefs that feel obvious until they stop working. The problem is not that humans are wrong once in a while. The problem is that certainty makes wrong beliefs harder to outgrow. Growth requires the unsettling admission that today's deepest conviction may become tomorrow's embarrassing memory. The chapter attacks certainty because certainty protects identity. People cling to stories such as "nobody will love me," "my boss will never value me," or "my family must be wrong," not because the stories are pleasant, but because testing them would threaten the self built around them. Manson calls this the law of avoidance. The more something threatens your identity, the more you avoid it. That can apply to success as much as failure. A new achievement may demand a new self. A rejection may expose an old self as false. Either way, the mind prefers familiar pain to uncertain freedom. Manson also describes people as architects of their own beliefs. Given random buttons and a light, people invent patterns even where none exist. Once the pattern feels like theirs, they defend it. This explains why the mind can turn almost any experience into evidence for an existing identity. The person who believes they are unlovable finds proof in silence. The person who believes they are morally superior finds proof in disagreement. The person who believes success would betray who they are avoids success as carefully as failure. Erin gives the abstract argument a human face. She is smart, educated, and relentlessly positive, but her certainty has become detached from reality. She believes she can cure death, that a destined relationship overrides ordinary boundaries, and that every rejection is only another test of persistence. Manson's point is uncomfortable because Erin practices many self-help virtues on the surface: visualization, confidence, persistence, action. What ruins them is the value underneath. Certainty turns all evidence into fuel for the same obsession. So growth becomes impossible precisely where effort looks most intense. This is why the chapter's medicine is deliberate uncertainty. You do not improve by proving yourself right. You improve by asking where you might be wrong, what you have not seen, and which value is being protected by your refusal to look. The chapter includes a family drama around a sister's relationship to show how destructive certainty can become when someone mistakes suspicion for moral clarity. Manson does not ask for paralysis. He asks for a little less certainty, enough to reopen contact with reality. The healthier life is not the one with perfect beliefs. It is the one that can update its beliefs without treating every update as death. Chapter 7. Failure is the way forward. Rock bottom arrives early in this chapter, and Manson calls it fortunate. He entered adulthood during the financial collapse with no stable work, lost savings, a couch to sleep on, and very little left to protect. That sounds bleak, but the point is that failure had already happened. Once the feared bottom arrived, he could move. The chapter uses this to reverse the usual relationship between failure and success. Success is not the absence of failure. It is built through failure by people whose values let them learn from pain rather than hide from it. Picasso gives the cleanest image. An old Picasso sketches on a napkin, asks a woman for a huge price, and explains that the drawing took him more than 60 years. The value is not the minutes at the cafe. It is the lifetime of practice. Manson argues that Picasso's real metric was honest expression. Because the value was the process, he could keep producing long after fame and money were secure. The opposite metric, become famous or become rich, would eventually strangle the work. That is the failure-success paradox. Improvement requires caring about the process that produces failure, not only the trophy that appears after enough failed attempts. The chapter then turns to pain as part of growth. Kazimierz Dabrowski studied survivors of war and argued that fear, anxiety, and sadness can become the necessary pain of psychological development. Manson is careful enough to avoid saying trauma is good. The point is that some pain becomes usable when a person can integrate it into responsibility, compassion, and a stronger self. Denying pain blocks that work. He connects this to ordinary learning as well. The child pressing every button on a machine learns by breaking the illusion of mastery. The adult who refuses embarrassment refuses the same path. Finally comes the do something principle. Motivation often does not arrive before action. Action creates evidence, emotion, and momentum, which then create more motivation. Manson's own early blog began without a grand plan. Doing the work showed him what could come next. The chapter's practical reversal is simple. Do not wait until you feel ready, confident, or inspired. Start with a small action, let the result teach you, and allow failure to become information instead of identity. Chapter 8. The importance of saying no. Absolute freedom looks glamorous until it refuses to choose. Manson sells his possessions, moves through Latin America and Asia, runs an online business, and appears to be living the freedom fantasy. But underneath the travel is a problem he does not yet want to name. Commitment scares him because commitment requires rejection. To choose one place, one person, one craft, or one value means refusing others. A life with no looks open from the outside, but inside it often becomes weightless. Nothing can deepen because nothing is allowed to exclude. This is why rejection becomes a virtue. A value has meaning only if it rejects what violates it. Honesty rejects deception. A marriage rejects endless alternatives. A craft rejects the distraction that would keep skill shallow. Manson then applies the same logic to relationships through boundaries. A healthy relationship requires each person to take responsibility for their own values and problems, and not demand that the other person carry what is not theirs. Toxic relationships blur that line. Victims demand rescue. Savers demand the emotional reward of rescuing. Both avoid responsibility by using the other person as a way to regulate pain. The boundary examples make the idea practical. Jealousy that demands control, guilt that forbids distance, and resentment that makes another person responsible for your emotions all confuse love with ownership. Healthy support is voluntary. It is not a bargain extracted by anger, fear, or obligation. That is why Manson separates victims from savers. The victim makes helplessness into leverage. The saver makes rescue into identity. Their patterns fit together beautifully and destructively, because each person lets the other avoid responsibility. Manson's treatment of romantic love is deliberately deflating. Love can feel intoxicating, but intoxication is not a moral compass. Emotional highs do not prove health. Trust requires the ability to tell the truth, receive rejection, survive conflict, and still choose the relationship deliberately. His deliberately ordinary example is telling his wife when an outfit does not work, and accepting that she can tell him when he is wrong. The point is not rudeness. It is that a relationship with no truthful rejection becomes theater. Without no, every yes becomes cheap. Without conflict, there is no test of whether the bond can carry reality. This is also why a culture that worships endless options becomes anxious. Every option kept open is also a depth refused. The fear of missing out can become a fear of belonging anywhere. The chapter ends by returning to commitment as a form of freedom. Breadth gives many possible lives, but depth comes only by giving up most of them. Manson's own shift toward writing, a long-term relationship, a stable location, and a smaller set of genuine friendships shows the paradox. Limits are not the enemy of freedom. Chosen limits create the conditions in which freedom can become meaningful. Chapter 9. And Then You Die. Josh's last night gives the final chapter its force. He is Manson's friend who dies after a party by a lake in Texas. Josh's last line to him is playful and mock-profound, but the death that follows is not playful at all. Manson is 19, staring into the dark after his friend's body is pulled from the water, and something in his identity breaks open. Death makes the usual embarrassments smaller. It pushes him toward travel, honesty, risk, responsibility, and a life less ruled by shame. The point is not that grief instantly becomes wisdom. The point is that mortality can reorder values more violently than any argument. Ernest Becker gives the chapter its theory. Becker argues that human beings know they will die, and that this knowledge creates a deep terror we usually manage indirectly. We build immortality projects. Families, careers, religions, nations, reputations, art, politics, money, and movements that promise our conceptual self will outlast the physical body. These projects are not automatically bad. Civilization is built from them. But they become dangerous when people defend them as if their eternal existence depends on them. Then vanity turns into cruelty, ideology, violence, and panic. Manson connects Becker back to the whole book. Immortality projects are values. When our values are shallow, fragile, or self-centered, death terror leaks into ordinary life as entitlement and anxiety. When values are chosen well, death becomes a compass. It shows that attention is finite, that the trivial is expensive, and that the important has to be lived now. Becker's bitter antidote is not to pretend death is pleasant. It is to stop letting the fear of death secretly choose your values for you. A person who can look at finitude directly becomes harder to bribe with status, outrage, fantasy, or applause. Manson's image of standing on a cliff near the Cape of Good Hope carries that realization physically. He is afraid, alive, and small before something vast. The thought of death does not make him nihilistic. It makes his addictions, fears, failures, and rejections lighter because they no longer get to pretend they are ultimate. The book closes where it began, near Bukowski's refusal to worship appearances. Everyone dies. That fact can flatten life into terror, or it can clarify which few things deserve devotion. The subtle art ends as a finite art. Give your cares to values that can survive the sight of death.